This is part 5. Justice. Unrest reduced by 25% on all our planets. Happiness of all pups is increased by 5% and unity by 5%. Policy risk is increased by minus 20%, and the effect of increased traditional costs caused by the number of colonies is reduced by 10%. Edict length is increased by 10%, edict cost is decreased by 10%. Influence cap is increased by 1,000. Our influence output is increased by 25%. Liberty. Happiness of all pups is increased by 5%. Slave unrest is reduced by 20%, and unrest is reduced by 10% on all our planets. Conviction. Governing ethics attraction is increased by 20%. New colonies start with an additional 1 population, and claim influence cost is reduced by 10%. Happiness of all our factions is increased by 5%, while no faction is suppressed. Empire leader pool is increased by 2, and Empire leader capacity is increased by 2. Mechanism. Mineral output is increased by 5%, and building speed by 15%. Upkeep cost and build cost of construction ships is reduced by 75%. Mining station build cost is decreased by 11%. Consumer good cost is reduced by 15%, and building cost by 5%. We can build Titan mechanical knights and mechanical knights. Army damage is increased by 10%. Powerful units. Research speed of engineering is increased by 15%. Starbase hull points increased by 50%. Militism. Increased resource production by all our pops by 5%, while we are at or over our naval capacity. Army cost reduced by 33%, and ship build speed reduced by 5%. In addition, every pop on our planet will generate a special military army. General skills increased by 2. General recruitment cost reduced by 50%. Army experience gain increased by 25%. Naval capacity is increased by 10%, and fleet command limit by 20%. Unlocks building planetary defense cannon. Increases happiness by 2.5% and 5% on building to stronghold/fortress building. In addition, defense army damage and defense army health is increased by 20%. We can maintain up to 5 admirals without it having effect on our leader capacity. Experience leader gain increased by 25%. For all our admirals, and ship experience gain increased by 25%. Mystery. Our society is covered in a shroud of secrecy. Faction influence gain increased by 30%. Ruler level cap by 1. FTL speeds increased by 50%. Ship disengage cans by 25%. Governing ethics attraction increased by 10%. Edict acceleration increased by 10%. Research speed, physics increased by 15%. Our leaders gain the mystic trait, which provide minor bonus. Nature. Research speed societies increased by 10%, and research speed biology increased by 10%. Habitability increased by 10%. Food output increased by 15%. Every tile of our planet has a 33% chance to generate additional research deposits. This includes all planets conquered and colonized. A planet can only be affected once. Clear blocker cost decreased by 50%. Consumer good cost decreased by 50%. Order. Consumer good cost decreased by 15%. Suppressing a faction costs half the amount of influence and reduces the faction happiness by only 10%. Additional governing ethics attraction increased by 5%. Happiness of all factions increased by 3%. Slave mineral production increased by 15%. Population growth speed increased by 20%. Core sector systems increased by 1, edict cost reduced by 5%, and planned unrest reduced by 10%. Piracy unlocks the plunder war gold. In addition, piracy reduced by 25%. Destroying enemy ships and stations provides minerals. Amount increases with the size of the ship and station, and even more if the station if it is a station which is destroyed. Let us raid our neighbors, gaining yearly mineral and energy credits. Amount increased with the size of our respective empires. Raid neighbors have their energy credits reduced by 10%, and their opinions of us reduced by 100. We can select which neighbors to raid by using the raider's targeting policy. Reduce food and mineral output by 15% and increase the building upkeep by 15% for all our rivals. Maximum rivalries increased by 1. Ruthless fighters. Fire rate and weapons damage is increased by 5%. The happiness for all pups which are full citizens or non-enslaved while living under the caste system is increased by 5%. Slave output for food and minerals is increased by 5%. Spaceborne. Starbase capacity is increased by 20%. Naval capacity is increased by 15%. Ship build cost decreased by 5%. Starboard build cost and starboard upgrade cost is decreased by 25%. FTL speeds by 25%. Ship speeds increased by 25%. All stars in the system with a planet we control produces an additional 5 energy. Starbase building cost reduced by 20%. Starboard's build speed increased by 50%. Starbase module build cost reduced by 20%. Starbase module build speed is increased by 50%. Collective individual. Our unity output is increased by 10%. Whenever our leader levels up, gain 10 influence. Consumer good cost decreased by 10%. Resettlement cost decreased by 10%. Scientist leader level cap increased by 1. Additional, whenever a scientist level up, increase their bonus to research speed by 50% in one category, as well as their anomaly generation chance by 25%. Governing ethics attraction increased by 10%, and annuity output by 5%. Admiral level cap increased by 1 whenever an admiral levels up. For 1 year, their bonus to sublight speed, fire rate, and FTL speed increases by 25%. Resource output increased by 5% on planets without any unrest. Ruler level cap increased by 1 whenever a ruler levels up. The cost of building buildings, armies, ships, star bases, and the cost to clear blockers is reduced by 15%. Naval capacity increased by 15%, and army cost reduced by 15%. Empire leader capacity increased by 3. Army morale increased by 20%, and rest is reduced by 10% on all our planets. Migration speed increased by 25%. Leader experience gain increased by 15%. When we select this, we select either collective or individual, and we only gain half the choice. Either top effect is for the collective trait, combine effect for an individual trade. Not sure how they set this up, but fairly interesting. And that's it for part 5.